Here is what nobody is connecting right now. While the world is watching drone strikes light up Tehran, while American bombs are obliterating IRGC command centers, while the Middle East burns in real time, a completely different kind of fire is consuming Ottawa, Canada. And this second fire, this one has the potential to reshape the future of one of the most consequential relationships on Earth. This is the story of a prime minister who made one of the most dangerous and contradictory foreign policy decisions in recent Canadian history. Who got slammed for it from inside his own party? Who tried to walk it back, couldn't, and now finds himself trapped? The fury of Donald Trump on one side, the outrage of his own Liberal MPs on the other. In the next 20 minutes, I am going to show you exactly how this unfolded, why it matters more than anything else you have read this week, and what it reveals about the impossible choice every Democratic government on Earth is now being forced to make in the age of Trump. Stay with me, because this goes deeper than any headline you have seen. Subscribe to Daily Brief if you haven't already, because this kind of analysis, the full picture, not the sound bites, is exactly what this channel exists to deliver. Let's go back to the morning of February 28th, 2026. It is just after midnight in Washington. Donald Trump releases an 8-minute video on Truth Social. The United States and Israel have launched coordinated military operations against Iran. The official name of the operation is Operation Epic Fury. Bombs are falling on Tehran, Isfahan, Karaj, and Kermanshah. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has been assassinated. The Middle East is on fire. Every government on Earth is scrambling to figure out what to say. In London, Keir Starmer hedges. In Paris, Macron reaches for diplomatic language. In Berlin, Friedrich Merz says almost nothing. In Madrid, Pedro Sanchez goes on national television and says, clearly and without ambiguity, no to war. Most European leaders chose some version of restraint, studied neutrality, cautious distance. And then there was Canada. Canada's prime minister was in India when the bombs started falling. He was in the middle of a trade and diplomatic mission, meeting with Prime Minister Narendra Modi when word reached him of the strikes. And the statement that came out of Ottawa that morning, jointly in the names of the Prime Minister and Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand, was not cautious. It was not hedged. According to reporting from CBC News and Policy Magazine, the joint statement read in part, Canada supports the United States acting to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and to prevent its regime from further threatening international peace and security. Canada reaffirms Israel's right to defend itself. Canada has long seen Iran as the principal source of instability and terror throughout the Middle East. The regime and its proxies have murdered hundreds of Canadian civilians. Let that register. While France was expressing concern, while Spain was saying no to war, while Germany was remaining mostly silent, Canada, under a brand new prime minister who had just delivered a celebrated speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos about defending the rules-based international order and standing up to hegemons who trample weaker nations, came out and endorsed Donald Trump's war on Iran, not with caveats, not with legal reservations, not with calls for UN authorization, with support, unambiguous, written, official, governmental, support. And then the phone lines in Ottawa started ringing. Announcement number 1, the rebellion from inside the House. The backlash was immediate, and it came from the most uncomfortable direction possible. It came from inside the Liberal tent. Lloyd Axworthy, one of the most respected and senior figures in the entire history of the Liberal Party of Canada, a former Foreign Affairs Minister who helped create the Ottawa Treaty banning landmines, who shaped an entire generation of Canadian foreign policy thinking, published a scorching op-ed within hours of the statement dropping. Axworthy did not mince words. As reported by CBC News, he wrote that the Prime Minister was abandoning Canada's commitment to preventing aggressive war. He said Canada was simply endorsing Trump's obsession with becoming an imperial power. He called it, in his view, the worst kind of situation for Canada. And then he drew the comparison that cut deepest of all. He invoked 2003, the most famous moment of Canadian foreign policy independence in modern history. The moment Prime Minister Jean Chrétien stood before the House of Commons and told the United States that Canada would not join the invasion of Iraq because it was not authorized by the United Nations Security Council. That decision is now celebrated as a defining moment of Canadian sovereign identity. Axworthy was saying directly that the prime minister was doing the opposite, choosing to stand with Trump where Chrétien had chosen to stand with international law. And Axworthy made a point that went even deeper than the Iran question. He reminded Canadians, as cited in CBC's coverage, that Iran is not an isolated case, that this attack was the seventh country against which President Trump has ordered the unilateral use of force while in office. 7 countries: Venezuela, Syria, and now Iran, in the most dramatic and consequential operation yet. Axworthy argued that a middle power like Canada, a country that has historically defined its identity by championing international law and multilateral institutions, should be screaming from the rooftops that this pattern is unacceptable. Instead, his prime minister was waving the flag. That was just the beginning. Liberal MP Will Greaves, a former professor of international relations who had just been elected to the House of Commons, posted a video on Instagram that night that went viral. He said Canada cannot endorse the unilateral and illegal use of military force, the killing of civilians, or the assassination of foreign heads of government, while also insisting that Canada's own sovereignty, rights, and independence must be respected. That last phrase carried specific and unmistakable weight. He was not just talking about Iran. He was talking about Canada. He was talking about the fact that Trump has repeatedly threatened to annex Canada, called it the 51st state, imposed tariffs designed to devastate the Canadian economy, made clear that he views Canadian sovereignty as conditional on Canadian compliance. Greaves was pointing out the obvious contradiction. You cannot endorse a president who kills foreign leaders without authorization and then expect that same president to respect your own borders and your own laws. The video was liked by a cascade of fellow Liberal MPs, former Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault, Braden Clark, Jeanette Levac, Patrick Weiler, Samir Zuberi, all Liberals, all members of the Prime Minister's own parliamentary coalition, all signaling their discomfort publicly. NDP leader Don Davies piled on, stating that endorsing illegality, violence, and destruction over dialogue and peaceful resolution was not what Canadians were promised and is not what Canadians support. This is a political crisis. In public, from within the Prime Minister's own coalition, and it gets more chaotic. While all of this was happening, while Axworthy was writing, while Liberal MPs were posting, while the NDP was condemning, 3 senior Canadian officials sent 3 completely different messages to the world on the same day. The Prime Minister backed the strikes. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand put out a separate statement calling for all parties to prioritize the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure and to return to negotiations. Defense Minister Bill Blair went on television and called for a ceasefire. Stop! A Prime Minister supporting the war. A Foreign Minister calling for diplomacy. A Defense Minister calling for a ceasefire. 3 different positions, 3 different signals, 1 Canadian government. If you are an ally trying to understand where Canada stands, you are getting whiplash. If you are a voter trying to understand whether your prime minister has a coherent foreign policy, you are getting nothing but confusion. If this analysis is making sense so far, hit like and subscribe to Daily Brief. This is what we do here. Cut through the noise and give you the full, unfiltered story. Announcement number 2. The walkback that wasn't. The Prime Minister had been conspicuously avoiding direct questions since the war began. He canceled a scheduled press conference in India, claiming his meetings with Modi had run over time. Reporters traveling with him grew increasingly frustrated. Back in Ottawa, the questions were multiplying. Finally, on March 3rd, as reported by the CBC and confirmed by the official statement on the Government of Canada website, the Prime Minister released an updated position. He added language he had omitted from the first statement. The new statement read in part, Canada reaffirms that international law binds all belligerents. He also added a call for rapid de-escalation. He said that Canada implores all parties, including the United States and Israel, to respect the rules of international engagement. But he held his original position. He did not retract the support. He did not say the strikes were wrong. He elaborated on his thinking, that his support was not a blank check, that it was not participation, that it was a position taken because of the nuclear threat posed by Iran. Then on March 4th, speaking at the Lowy Institute in Sydney, Australia, the Prime Minister did something remarkable. As reported by NPR, Fortune, and multiple international outlets, he said for the first time on record that Canada supported the strikes with some regret. He said the war represented, in his own words, an extreme example of a rupturing world order. And then he acknowledged what critics had been saying since day one. As reported by Al Jazeera and confirmed by Canadian press traveling with the delegation, the Prime Minister told reporters, "We were not informed in advance. We were not asked to participate. Prima facie, it appears that these actions are inconsistent with international law." Pause. Read that again. A sitting Prime Minister is saying on the record that his country's closest ally and largest trading partner appears to have launched an illegal war. A war that the same Prime Minister endorsed just 4 days earlier. Announcement number 3, the answer that changed everything, then came March 5th, 2026. Standing alongside Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese in Canberra during a joint press conference, the Prime Minister was asked the question every observer had been waiting for. Would Canada get involved militarily in the Iran war? According to Al Jazeera, CBC, Fox News, and NPR, all reporting the same answer, Canada's Prime Minister said, "One can never categorically rule out participation." He added that Canada will stand by our allies. He said the question was hypothetical, but he did not say no. Let that land. The Prime Minister of Canada, and on March 5th, 2026, refused to rule out sending Canadian soldiers to fight in Donald Trump's war in Iran, a war that the same Prime Minister said just 24 hours earlier appeared to violate international law. This is the trap. And as Policy Magazine laid out with devastating precision in its analysis of what they called Carney's Iran trap, the mechanism of that trap is precise. By endorsing the stated objective of stopping Iran's nuclear program while distancing Canada only from the planning of the operation, the Prime Minister narrowed his margin of maneuver. The moment you say you support the goal, you open the door to being asked to support the means. Trump has already played this playbook against Keir Starmer. When Britain initially refused to allow the United States to use British military bases at Diego Garcia and RAF Fairford as staging points for strikes on Iran, Trump went on camera and compared Starmer unfavorably to Winston Churchill. He said, and these are documented, widely reported words, "This is not Winston Churchill that we are dealing with, a calculated humiliation designed to make the British Prime Minister look weak, cowardly, and unworthy of the alliance." Starmer capitulated. Britain then agreed to allow the U.S. to use its bases. Then Trump turned his attention to Spain. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez had refused to allow the United States to use joint military bases at Moron and Rota for strikes against Iran. He went on national television and said simply, "No to war." Trump threatened a full U.S. trade embargo on Spain, a nation inside the European Union, over its refusal to cooperate with an unauthorized military operation. This is the template. This is what Canada is watching, and this is why the stakes of Canada's strategic ambiguity are so enormous. Because the question is not just where Canada stands on Iran today. The question is, what happens when Trump makes the ask directly, formally, and personally? What happens when Trump calls and says, "I need Canadian personnel, I need Canadian bases, I need Canadian ships, I need a public statement of full military commitment, and in exchange, I will protect CUSMA. I will reduce tariffs. I will stop calling Canada the 51st state." That call, if the war drags on for weeks or months rather than the 4 to 5 weeks Trump initially promised, will come. As Policy Magazine wrote, Trump will cherry pick and throw the Prime Minister's own Davos words back at him. At Davos in January 2026, Canada's Prime Minister stood before the world's most powerful leaders and declared that Canada would be principled in its commitment to fundamental values, including the prohibition of the use of force, except when consistent with the UN Charter. Trump, if he wants Canadian support, can look directly across the table and say, "Iran had nuclear weapons. It threatened peace and security. You said so yourself. You supported the objective. Now support the operation." What is your answer? And this makes the moment so uniquely painful, because the Prime Minister's political identity is built on a very specific set of ideas. He is not a conventional politician. He is an economist, a former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, a man who made his name as a technocrat of extraordinary intelligence and global standing. His Davos speech in January 2026 was received as one of the most important foreign policy addresses by any world leader in years. He argued that the old rules-based international order, the post-World War II architecture of the United Nations, the Security Council, international law, multilateral institutions, was not coming back. He said the world was undergoing a rupture. He said hegemons were increasingly acting without constraint or respect for international norms, while others bore the consequences. He said Canada would be a middle power that stood on principle, not one that meekly accommodated hegemons one-on-one. Those were his words in January. And then in March, when the single most dramatic example of a hegemon acting without constraint arrived in the form of a joint U.S.-Israeli assassination of a sitting supreme leader without UN authorization, his first instinct was to endorse it. The contradiction has not been lost on anyone. As analyzed in The Conversation, a former diplomat writing in the days after the initial statement said the prime minister was simply giving up on the values he had championed at Davos the moment they became expensive. The analysis from justice and conflict scholars was equally sharp. The legality of military strikes is not determined by whether the targeted state is an ally or an adversary, just as the lawfulness of murder is not determined by the likability of the victim. If Canada endorses illegal war against Iran today because Iran is odious, Canada has no principled ground from which to object when someone decides to wage illegal war against a country Canada likes. Or, as one analyst asked with chilling directness, who is next? Turkey, Cuba, Greenland, Canada itself? That last word is not hyperbole. Trump has openly and repeatedly threatened Canadian sovereignty. He has called for the annexation of Canada. He has referred to the previous prime minister as governor of the great state of Canada. He imposed sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods. He threatened economic devastation unless Canada complied with American demands on trade, defense spending, and border policy. Canada is not a random bystander in Trump's imperial vision of a reorganized North America. Canada is, in Trump's own stated conception, a subordinate entity to be absorbed or coerced. And yet here is Canada's prime minister in the very same week that Iran is being bombed into regime change without UN authorization, refusing to clearly and unequivocally state that the use of force against sovereign nations without UN authorization is wrong, because he is afraid of what Trump might do to the Canadian economy if he does. The realpolitik calculus has been laid bare by analysts across the political spectrum. As one analyst summarized it without sentimentality, for Canada to oppose, to lecture on human rights or on international law would have been costly. Trump remembers this stuff. It is a crude calculation, but it reflects the impossible reality the government is facing. Canada needs CUSMA, the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement, to survive. As the transcript's analysis noted, Canadian exports are 90% dependent on American market access. The auto sector, the energy sector, the agricultural sector, all of it flows south across a border that Trump has already threatened to weaponize. In the Prime Minister's calculation, the price of endorsing an illegal war against an adversarial state was lower than the price of publicly rebuking the American president he needs on side for the next 4 years of trade negotiations. That was the decision made in the first hours of the war. But the problem with a realist calculation is that reality keeps moving. The war that was supposed to be over in 4 to 5 weeks shows no sign of ending quickly. Iran is retaliating across 15 countries. American soldiers are dead. More than 1,000 Iranians are estimated killed. 100,000 people are displaced within Iran alone. 38,000 people have crossed into Syria from Lebanon. Dubai International Airport, the busiest in the world for international passengers, has been largely shut down. Over 100,000 Canadians are registered in the region. Canada scrambled to secure evacuation flights out of Beirut. The Prime Minister personally called the President of the UAE to thank him for protecting 24,500 Canadians in that country. This war is not staying in Iran. A British base in Cyprus was struck by a drone. A French facility in Abu Dhabi was targeted. A base hosting Italian troops in Kuwait was hit. Saudi oil facilities were attacked. NATO air defense systems shot down an Iranian missile traveling toward Turkish airspace, the first time the alliance's forces intercepted an Iranian missile threatening a member state. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte called Trump the leader of the free world and endorsed the operation. But below the rhetoric, NATO allies are quietly seething. Jeremy Shapiro of the European Council on Foreign Relations put it with crystalline precision, as reported by multiple outlets covering the alliance's response. Allies are in a position where they can't support it, and they can't not support it. They hate it, but they can't not support it because the United States is too wound up in their defense. That is exactly the position Canada is in, with one extra layer of vulnerability that most European allies do not have. Canada shares a land border with the United States. Canada's economy is structurally integrated with the American economy in ways that no European nation is. When Trump threatens a trade war with Spain, Spain can partially shelter behind the EU's collective trade architecture. When Trump threatens Canada, there is no multilateral shield. There is just the border, the tariffs, and the phone call from Mar-a-Lago. Leave a comment below. Tell me, do you think Canada made the right call? Or did this prime minister just set a trap he cannot escape? I read every single comment on Daily Brief, every one. So where does this leave Canada? In a position that satisfies no one. The critics of the Iran war, and there are many, inside the Liberal caucus, in the NDP, in the Canadian public, see a prime minister who abandoned principle for access. The Trump administration sees a prime minister who publicly said the strikes appear to violate international law, which, if you are sitting in the Oval Office, is not the language of a loyal ally. European counterparts see a Canadian leader whose messaging has been so chaotic and contradictory that it is genuinely difficult to understand what Canada's foreign policy position is. And the Canadian public, watching missiles fall, airports close, and their prime minister refuse to rule out sending their sons and daughters to fight in a war he himself says may be illegal, is getting very few straight answers. I want to be precise about something here, because there is a version of this story that frames the prime minister as simply a hypocrite, and I do not think that captures the full picture. He is not a bad man. He is not an ideologue or a warmonger. He is a brilliant, pragmatic, deeply serious person trying to navigate an impossible situation in real time with incomplete information, a trade crisis, a fresh electoral mandate, an active conflict zone containing over 100,000 of his citizens, and the most unpredictable American president in living memory. The mess he has made of Canada's messaging this week is not a character failure. It is a symptom of the impossible position that Trump has created for every Democratic ally. You either endorse the war and lose your principles, or you oppose it and lose your access. And in a world where access to the American market is the difference between economic stability and economic devastation, that is not a theoretical dilemma. It is a daily, grinding, impossible political reality. But here is what history will judge. If Canada cannot say that the assassination of a foreign head of state without UN authorization is wrong, when the assassin is your ally and the victim is your adversary, then on what basis will Canada ever say it is wrong? If the principle only applies to enemies and never to friends, it is not a principle. It is just loyalty dressed up in legal language. The United Nations Charter that Canada is failing to defend was written in 1945 with direct Canadian participation. Canada helped build the post-war world. Canada championed the Ottawa Treaty. Canada pushed for the International Criminal Court. Canada gave the world the concept of the responsibility to protect, the idea that sovereignty is not a shield behind which governments can massacre their own people. These are not just historical footnotes. They are the foundation of the identity that Canada has constructed for itself on the world stage for 80 years. And right now, that foundation is cracking under the weight of a trade deal and a phone call from Florida. I see two paths from here, no middle ground. Path one, the Prime Minister uses the next 72 hours to articulate a clear, coalition-based, principled middle power position. He builds a coordinated front with Australia, Japan, the EU. He says formally and publicly that Canada will not participate militarily in any operation not authorized by the United Nations. He absorbs whatever economic pain Trump delivers in response. He bets that standing on principle now gives Canada a stronger long-term position with its own citizens, with its European partners, and even with a future American administration. It costs him. It costs the Canadian economy, but it saves something harder to rebuild. It saves credibility. Path two, the war drags on. Trump makes the formal ask. The prime minister says yes, or says something close enough to yes that it functions as yes. Canadian assets are deployed in some capacity in support of a war that the prime minister himself said appeared to violate international law. The Davos speech becomes a historical footnote. The Chrétien precedent of 2003 is not repeated, it is inverted. So I want to leave you with the questions that matter. Is the prime minister saving Canada's economy, or is he trading Canada's identity for a trade deal? Can you endorse a war as illegal and still refuse to categorically rule out fighting in it and remain a credible actor on the world stage? And the question that sits beneath all the others, when the dust settles, when the missiles stop falling, which countries will have stood for something and which countries will have simply survived? That answer may define the next decade of geopolitics. Leave your take in the comments. I read every single one. Share this video with someone who needs the full picture, not just the headlines. And subscribe to Daily Brief if you want the analysis that goes beyond the surface. Because the story of Canada, Iran, and Trump is not just Canada's story. It is the story of every country on earth trying to figure out how to survive.